On this episode of Contra, I interview Dr. Timothy Paré. Tim is a psychologist that's been practicing for over 30 years, and his current specialty is in narrative therapy. We talk about how he's come to believe that this is one of the most powerful interventions for an individual seeking therapy, and as well as some of the other approaches in the field, and how he views consciousness and what he calls the old brain. Thanks for listening. Hello and welcome to Contra. I have Timothy Paré here with me, who is a psychologist practicing in Victoria. And, welcome to the podcast, Tim.
Thank you, Greg. This is fun. It's good to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you. So what we talked about before the podcast was, how you see psychology has kind of changed and grown over the last, say 100 years. And then, how your practice has shifted over the last few years. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. When I think about it, going back when I did it in the master's level, in training in psychology, one of the things they did focus on, right, the first step in a way to become a therapist, that was actually pretty effective, very simple, but they spent a lot of the time teaching us in one course just to be good listeners.
Okay.
And they kind of call it active listening. So they wanted you to be able to... So we kind of had paired off with another student, and the other student would have some difficulty they were going through, probably encouraged not to be too intense or serious.
Okay.
But, something they're going through, and then they would talk, and then you would respond as the therapist, and your goal was to respond basically exactly what they said. So they taught us to paraphrase and to repeat back what you heard. And you had to record it, and then you had to write it down. And what you found out really quickly was that when somebody speaks to you about what they're going through, often you don't actually paraphrase and go and reflect back. You actually add things.
Okay.
And, we would start with an interview, and then you would, if you listen to it afterwards, you'd say, no, I changed the word there. The person said they were going through a difficult time, and then you'd say, well, wow, how are you dealing with that stress? And you realize they didn't say stress. And so we're hearing it somewhat from our own perspective, and of course we're going to project onto that what we think we would feel.
Right.
Or what they might have said from our own experience. So, and then...
Do you see that as one of the fundamental good measures of a psychologist is their ability just to be a good listener to the client or the patient?
I really do, actually. I think that was a course that still sticks with me. And the point was that we think we're good listeners, but we're not aware how we're coloring what we're hearing with our own experience. And until we start to really be conscious of saying, so, often it would be so are you saying this? So and or you say, it sounds like you're saying this.
So put it as a question rather than a
statement. Yeah, which is kind of respecting that you don't know and you're trying to get clarity. Now, the funny part of it in some ways is that at first we had to repeat exactly what they were saying. And then, some people probably get irritated by that because, you say, oh, I'm going through a difficult time. Oh, you're going through a difficult time.
Yeah.
And then, but it was a good thing to do so that you realize you weren't straying from what the person was actually saying.
Was it hard not to have your thoughts drift at that time?
It was hard to think, wonder what they're really feeling, but you were supposed to stay right with them. And then when you got better at it, later in the course they called it advanced accurate empathy, where you were sounds like a real scientific process, but you were allowed at that point to show that you might be able to read between the lines and say something like if a person's describing some painful thing they went through, anger, let's say, at somebody, and you could say, it seems to me there might be some sadness in what you're experiencing. And if that, the person might say no, but you might have sensed it, and you think that they're not talking about that part of their experience. So you're kind of underlining that or bringing it out, which might lead to insight on their part. But you didn't sort of pry it out of them. You just kind of showed an interest in something that isn't being said. But wow. It was a kind of a neat idea that to be helpful, I think we have to set aside what we think will be helpful and try to really, get a sense of what actually is helpful in therapy. I mean, there were studies that I remember hearing that said the most important thing in therapy was the relationship. So it wasn't the approach. So then, we talk about cognitive behavioral therapy or Freudian or psychoanalytic therapy or there's probably hundreds now, right? But it wasn't so much which approach seemed to be most effective, but whether the relationship was one of support, listening, connection, believing in the person, I think, respecting them. And that was what people seemed to respond to. When they felt they had a good relationship, they felt the therapy was effective. So it wasn't the kind of therapy, but more that common or, factor.
And would that come from authenticity? Or could some people fake that?
No, that's a good point. I think it does come from authenticity and in the sense of being, not playing a role of the therapist. Well, I mean, that kind of leads actually to the next thing that I, in my own progression or trying, learning what turns you on. Like you'll listen to different theories about what's helpful in helping people change. And, I would say most of them are really talking about the same thing, but from different angles. So, the most popular therapy these days that you hear about, or the most, when people ask about therapy, they usually have heard of cognitive behavioral therapy.
I've certainly heard that. I don't actually really know what it means.
Okay, well, what often you'll hear, I think there's a bias somewhat because it can be studied, or it has been studied more effectively than the other approaches.
Okay.
It might be more logical and sequential, and so physicians often refer people for therapy, and I think it's more of a medical model. Like, it makes sense. The cognitions are incorrect. If we change the cognitions, people will get better. If they change their thinking. But it's almost like there's many ways to get to that. So if another therapy like emotionally focused therapy or Rogerian therapy, which was when big Carl Rogers came out, and his main thing was to listen to feelings. So he would just be called client-centered therapy. He would just listen to the person's feelings and be present to them. And it was all about, I'm here, I hear you, and I'm not going to tell you how to live your life. I'm just going to ask you what you're going through. So it was very different in a way from the other one, cognitive behavioral, which was all about, let's look at your thoughts. And they would even say there are, irrational thoughts that lead to suffering. For instance, if your friend seems to be upset at you, the irrational thought might be, I'm not going to be accepted in the world, or I'm not as popular as I thought. I won't be able to make friends, which are they would say that's an irrational thought. When you have one trouble with one friend and you've jumped to this generalization. So they kind of help you to look at it logically and question it, and then shift that view or notice your own patterns of irrational thinking.
Whereas a more emotional approach would be not so much to talk about those facts and how the person thinks about it, but just how they feel about it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, I mean, the emotional part, they might say, want to ask the person how they're feeling, but as they talk about how they're feeling, they might solve the problem that's contradictory in the thought itself. So they might say, I'm really sad that my friend, has rejected me or whatever, that I'm having this tough time. And then they might start saying, but maybe I shouldn't take it so badly. And, maybe I need to just reach out. And so the client would solve the problem themselves without anybody questioning the way they're thinking.
Kind of sounds to me like when you're teaching. So for example, teaching skiing, if you can become a fairly competent skier, but until you teach somebody to ski, now I think you get some new insights into it when somebody says, how do you turn? Oh, well, all you do is throw your weight this way. And they'll ask you like, well, what do you do with your inside leg? And then you'll actually have to carefully, if you're a good teacher, articulate all the different things that you've stored into muscle memory a long time ago, and maybe actually find a couple of those things that you're not doing properly yourself.
Yeah.
And have that, you don't need a head instructor.
Right.
You can just articulate that and find the little flaws and the leaps in your logic that you're using to jump over those things. And
and that, I think, it's interesting looking at, as we're talking about it, I can see the evolution in a way where psychology has gone, in the sense that there was the Rogerian Carl Rogers was all about emotions. Mm-hmm. The people on the cognitive behavioral side were much more about thoughts, but they were eventually, one therapy which I think is more current, it's probably more like 30 years old now, but narrative therapy came along, and that was an approach that basically said, let's listen to the client. So it was also very emotionally focused about what they're experiencing, but also the story. So the story would be more thoughts, right? And they called it narrative therapy. This is Michael White and David Epstein, who Australian therapists or psychologists, I think, who came up with narrative therapy. They called it that because they, in their research, and they looked outside their own field of psychology and into philosophy and stuff, and they saw that storytelling is like a central human behavior, that we do that. So they focused on what is the story the person has about their experience, and that would include the emotions and the thinking, and very respectful to listen to it from their point of view. So not to interject a kind of a, well, why did you do that? Or why, questioning them, or they want to kind of step back as much as possible so that they're not forcing their worldview onto the client. Okay. And they even talk about it in a way where they would say that therapy can be another form of colonization. Like the therapist has a view apparently of what is normal, what's expected, what is abnormal behavior. And the therapist is going to try and move the person from abnormal behavior towards some kind of normal behavior. Okay. And then they're very aware that could be really, colonizing somebody and actually, sort of marginalizing them or putting them into a category and not really trying to understand it from their point of view. So instead, the narrative people will just say, what is your experience? How are you looking at it? Is there any other way to look at it that you would find more helpful? Or they would call it exceptions. So, the person would say, this is what I'm going through, tell the stories of what their life is going like. And then they say, are there any times when you don't feel, let's say, depressed? And then they say, yeah, sometimes when I'm doing this. And they say, okay, well, what's that about? So that's like, it's not the dominant story of being depressed and that, life is meaningless. It's a side story, but it's still in there. It's still their worldview. Yeah. And then they would emphasize, tell me more about that, with the idea, in a sense, that story seems to be helpful.
So they just try to bring the more positive, life-affirming stories to the surface.
Yeah, and I think the term they might use is helpful. So they would say, is that in their mind they're thinking, if helpful, maybe another word would be effective. Okay. So you're really not feeling good and you're spending a lot of time alone at home. Do you find that? And you got to be careful you don't make it sound like you're patronizing, but you say, is it helpful to spend time alone right now? Mm-hmm. And they might say, yeah, but I'm probably doing it too much. Okay. And you say, well, why do you think you're doing it too much? Well, I'm not connecting with... And so you basically draw out the person's wisdom by asking them about things that are working in their life that are effective versus things that they're doing or thinking that are ineffective.
So like it sounds like a lot of these therapies are just giving somebody an opportunity to articulate their own experience and relate it to an active listener.
Yeah, and I think that was a big jump in therapy, in the sense that there was a time when we all, we watch movies or something, we think of Freud. Freud was supposed to be, he looked the part too, like this expert who understands, what is wrong with you. And is basically going to just, look straight into your mind and find out where the errors are.
Where's the hang up?
And that
what stage of development are you regressing to? Right?
And that somehow there's something wrong in the way you perceive the world, and it has something to do with the way you were brought up, probably, right? So there's always that question, like Freud would say something, tell me more about your mother or something. As if there was something specific that they could find. But it was more like they were the experts on you. And they were going to tell you at the end whether you were healthy or unhealthy. And even to the point where they would say to people, during analysis, so psychoanalysis, they say during the analysis period, which may take up to, say, 2 years, and sometimes they would see people twice a week or something or more.
Wow.
You shouldn't make any changes, any like significant changes in your life until you complete your analysis.
Over 2 years.
Yeah, because if you make changes like get married or change your job or do anything like that, you won't know whether you're making healthy decisions until you've been analyzed and you understand yourself.
I tell you what decisions to make.
Or maybe somewhat more positive, that maybe at the end you've analyzed yourself to a degree and now you know how to make good decisions.
Although, but it was at this time, would there be data? Like, is that, even if we now have come farther than that, is there data saying that was more effective than nothing? Say
that's a good point. I mean, there has been a lot of research on therapy. I remember when I was going to university, where a lot of the research showed that therapy wasn't very effective, really? If compared to a placebo. And
what would they use as a placebo for therapy?
Well, they might do something like to try and, like, they'd have two people doing therapy, and then they might have somebody just meeting with somebody and just talking about anything. To try and make it, control group, something they could compare to. Or therapy versus no therapy. So somebody, you check in with how people are doing who say they're depressed. 6 months later, you check in again. Then you have the people that are going to therapy for 6 months, and they found out people weren't doing that much better. Which is pretty disturbing when I was a student.
How do they control for the fact that life just consistently gets worse all the time?
Well, I mean, so hopefully that the idea that that's the factor that's different. If you do it enough people, that it should show whether it was. But I don't know. I haven't seen any of those more recent studies around whether it's how overall what the effect is. How effective it is. But I guess going back to what we were talking about, the idea that the Freudian or that early therapy, the expert as the doctor or whatever was an expert on behavior, the mind, and everything, and you were there, and they were going to tell you, in a sense, what was wrong. And then, as it evolved, now it's much in narrative therapy. That approach really honed in on how that doesn't. It's like by its its very nature, it's disempowering. Right. If you're going to sit down with somebody and you're going to say, "I know you better than you know you," or "I know which direction is healthy," and that you can treat the person in a kind of a abrupt way or challenge them on their beliefs, is really disempowering.
Yeah, and it's like, I generally don't like to throw around this word, but it does sound very patriarchal, really.
It does.
Like you're going to sit down with somebody who's a better human being, a more knowledgeable human being than you, and they're going to listen to you and tell you all the ways you're doing wrong and how you should change your life.
Yeah. Which
I'm sure there's some people out there that probably need that. At least that's my intuition, but oftentimes maybe not. And I've also heard that, therapy never works if somebody doesn't show up on their own accord. I'm curious what your opinion is on that.
Yeah. No, and I think the funny thing, my experience is that people might think when they come to therapy that they want advice or they want direction. Mm-hmm. But if you give them direction or advice, they usually don't seem comfortable almost immediately.
Yeah.
So it not only is it not that effective, and it might be disempowering to give people advice, but it also doesn't work because one of the things is people won't take on behavior or change their thoughts until they believe in it. Right? Mm-hmm. It's not going to stick even if you share something with them. And if they don't really believe it or it doesn't make sense to them, they're not going to remember it once they're out the door.
Yeah.
So it's much better if people look at their own life and decide how they want to change it or what isn't working for them or even how their thoughts aren't working for them, the certain thoughts that they're having. Mm-hmm. And in this approach, like narrative, it's not only narrative, there's a category they call collaborative approaches. So it's not that the expert is going to tell you, and it's not that the therapist isn't an influence, but that you're collaborating. Mm-hmm. It's more like, that idea of the personal coach or something.
And would this be like a similar thing, like peer support groups, like Alcoholics Anonymous or, all these addict kind of support groups, is that you just have a context to talk about your experience to people who are listening and not judging. And I don't know. Well,
no, that would be a little bit different because, I'm thinking more one-on-one therapy, or if it was a group, but the collaborating approach for the therapist is not to lead or direct, but more to ask, what does the person want to change? Share information, maybe. I like that they don't go, if you take it too far, you wouldn't be able to share information, right? Maybe that would be colonizing them or something, or pressing them in a certain direction. But you do it respectfully. You say, well, this is what I've heard about, let's say somebody has a problem with alcohol. Mm-hmm. And you could have you heard about the concept of denial? Mm-hmm. So if the person seems to be stuck in what we call this concept of denial, where they're minimizing the problem, mm-hmm. then it's okay for the therapist to bring that up respectfully and say, what do you think about that? Is it possible that you're experiencing some mm-hmm. denial? So it's more like it becomes part of the conversation in equals, sharing information, and you're providing something to the story, the narrative, but you're not pushing it on the person, right? You're not saying, I know better than you, like you're in denial.
Do you often have clients that will come to you with one issue? Let's just say it's, whatever, problems dealing with their spouse, and then you see something like alcoholism or like this, whatever trait it may mm-hmm. be. I'm sure you have a better example, but something that's just glaringly obvious, and you are trying to shape them into maybe talking about that or considering that, and it's difficult if they're kind of on a narrative where they believe this is their problem and they don't want to acknowledge that. Is that common?
Yeah, and that's interesting because there is some kind of roots to, or common themes that come up. And one of the common themes, I think, is if you looked at it as a personal growth issue, that people, I would say like a continuum where people say that the problem that they're having is outside of them, in the environment. So it's mm-hmm. about the people they're working with, or their partner, or the society they're in, or the kind of government. The problem is outside of them, so mm-hmm. they're struggling with reacting to people's behavior. And then as people go towards more, I think, awareness to what works, if you want to put it that way, efficacy, they start to realize that it's much better to work on your reaction to people than trying to really change people outside of you. Yeah. So if you have the difficult person at work, you get more effective by how do I handle that person, rather than going home being really angry, stressed, mm-hmm. fearful.
Even if you're right, even if that person is horrible and should change, it's a lot easier to change your reaction to them.
Exactly, right. So that's a challenge. You don't want to say to people, come on, the guy's difficult, or, like, why don't you just, because people won't feel validated on how stressed they are by this event or person or whatever. But when they get to being in more effective approaches, they're working on their reaction, their feelings. Like, why do I get angry around that person? What am I experiencing that leads to anger? Or why am I so sad about the loss of this relationship? So, people that say going through a breakup, they might talk a lot about their partner and how they mistreated them. They feel left by that partner, and they talk about how they were selfish or anything. But in the end, they come back to how they felt and how they're going to grieve the loss and how they're going to maybe forgive that person, and then they come to some kind of closure. So that's the pattern you see a lot. People come in, they're really reactive to other people, and your challenge as a therapist, how to find a way for them to work on the area they can work on, right? They can't change the person who's not there. So the only area that is effective is their own response to that person. And so that's the kind of the challenge. How do you ask questions of somebody respectfully and to move towards, I guess you would call it, personal agency, the ability to act to solve a problem without sounding like you're not listening to what they are defining as the problem. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That is kind of like the ultimate challenge, right? Because you don't want to not listen to their story. But if you think their story is just going to go nowhere, like they're in a rage and they're really angry at all the drivers in the city, mm-hmm. and they're just furious all the time about how people drive, you know that they're probably not going to resolve that issue because people are going to continue to drive the way they do. But
so if that's truly making them unavoidably unhappy, it's a pretty hopeless situation.
Well, the challenge is the therapist is to sort of hear that, but then find a way to see if you can underline, their reaction to bad drivers. Like you could say, I noticed that you're really getting angry about these bad drivers. Does that, are you concerned about your anger? Is it stressful?
Yeah.
Which is a respectful way of putting it. I mean, you got to be careful you're not sounding like it's stating the obvious too much, right? Like you banged your head against the wall 5 times. Did that help at all? You don't want to, but you do maybe want to shift the story over to something that they might be able to resolve. Mm-hmm. So in narrative, they call the exception, So you had these really difficult days, you've really been angry at drivers and everything. What about the day you didn't get angry? What did you do on that day? Mm. So then you would help them sort of break down their behavior, their thoughts, and how that day was a success. And then they might come to the conclusion it was the day that they stopped thinking about bad drivers. Yeah. And you didn't have to say it, because if you say it, you might get into an argument or you may be invalidating their experience. But you also get a sense that their anger and frustration you're not going to be helpful if all you do is listen to their anger and frustration. Yeah. And say, oh my God, which is funny because it brings us back, we were talking about the Rogerian approach, where they would listen to the feelings all the time, but they wouldn't question them at all. But I do wonder if it could be really effective if the person finally got to a solution on their own.
Just maybe slower than narrative therapy.
Narrative is, I think, finding a way to help the person solve the problem by asking more about what is effective, what isn't effective. And there's a lot of overlap. I'm really interested in Buddhism, Buddhist psychology, maybe Western Buddhist psychology is what I've read of more. But their term they would use, the Buddhists, is it skillful? So they might say to somebody, they use the term skillful instead of helpful, but it's the same idea. So like, so you're really angry at drivers in the city. Is it helping or is it skillful to be angry? Is it resolving the problem of the drivers?
Right.
Now, you'd have to ask in such a way where you're not patronizing, but you want to say, is that a skillful way to solve this problem? Mm-hmm. And that's the way I kind of look at it. And I think, there's a contradiction there, or there's a comparison between I was brought up Catholic, and I went until I was about 13. I stopped going to church and stuff. But in the Catholic or religious viewpoint, a lot of times, it's good and bad, right? It's not. It's like if you've done something, it's either good or wholesome, or or it's a sin. It's bad. Mm-hmm. Whereas narrative therapy and Buddhist thinking is more about, is it working? Is it effective? Let's not get into good, bad, but, is getting really angry at your son helping him? Mm-hmm. A religious view might be, it's a sin to yell at your kids. Then it becomes, in what way, it's very complex. What is a sin? So it's more like, is it helping your kid to yell at them? Does it help you? Do you feel better about anything? Or is it, and then it's more like getting away from the morality, emphasis on it, which makes people feel either judged or, getting into the good, bad paradigm, which doesn't seem to be very helpful.
Okay. So does Buddhism encourage this type of thought introspectively, or is it led by a more senior practitioner?
That's a great question. I think Buddha, if you look at the Buddhist thing, like even one of the comments, attributed to the Buddha is, be a light unto thyself. So instead of following the Buddha really said, don't follow me, like figure it out yourself, try it out. Right. Go out in the world and try things, and if they make you feel bad, maybe they're not very effective. If they make you feel fulfilled and you have good energy and you feel calmer or at peace, your mind feels quieter, then maybe that works. So they would often say, don't just go and follow some person who says they understand how the world works. Yeah,
the guru worshipping kind of thing.
Yeah. I think there's a book that's called If You See the Buddha on the Road, Kill Him. Yeah. It's basically that idea that you don't want to follow the person who's supposed to be the guru. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, I don't think Buddhists are saying you can't. They do have what they talk Dharma talks, where you go and you listen to wisdom that somebody's sharing with you, but it's still up to you whether you take it on or whether you ignore it.
So it's not as prescriptive as like a more classic Western ideology.
Yeah, exactly.
And do you believe, like, one thing I've heard that people kind of have like baseline levels of anxiety and depression, that if you're going about your life and you're very anxious about maybe your job is on the rocks, as soon as that situation resolves itself or you resolve it, you'll just kind of do a bit of a switch, and now you'll be really stressed out about the renovations that you have to do, and you'll complete your renovations, and now it'll just switch to your dog is sick, or people just kind of have this baseline level. Would you see that as like I don't know if that's an aspect of personality, but how much, like, once you're above, say, like a teenager, how fluid are these personality traits or whatever? I don't even know the term to use, but anxiety and depression. Yeah.
Well, that's a great question to get right to the center of what we know about psychology, about the mind and stuff, that I think it's a good distinction to make. And I think generally accepted in the field is that there's both a biological part of problems, like mental health problems, and maybe, you call it a psychological. So the biological being that we are, the term may be predisposed to a certain amount of anxiety. So let's say a person is born with a tendency to worry or be anxious, and it might be on a continuum. Some people very low. If there's no anxiety, sometimes they think it's so unusual that it might be, more a sociopathic thing, because you don't have any fears or worries about stuff.
Yeah.
And then, somewhere where moderate anxiety, fear, doubts, and then excessive where the mind is constantly questioning, looking for things that could go wrong, feeling insecure. And, well, that leads to, like, why do we have that, which is partly my favorite topic right now, which is sort of like evolution and the brain and this stuff. But before we go there, I just want your question about, so I think everybody has some predisposition for a level of things that would be helpful or unhelpful. So some people might be predisposed to be somewhat depressed. Mm-hmm. And it's hard because we use the same word. So what is the word depressed? You could say literally the person is low in energy. Mm-hmm. And that would be, you could call it maybe a biological thing. But if we say somebody's depressed, they have the depressed thoughts. So they think negative thoughts, or they feel like there's not hope for the future. That might lead to low energy. Yeah. And so it's one of these chicken and egg things all the time, right? In which, mm-hmm. Come up, so many issues come around with these circles, chicken and egg. So is the person feeling down and negative, and that leads to difficulties in their behavior, or do they start thinking negative things and then their body kind of goes downhill and they don't have energy and they don't want to get out of bed?
Yeah.
Maybe both. So some people, let's say they come into the world and they have a really good constitution, so they don't worry that much. Their mood is generally positive, or they're not, not troubled by things. But then experiences happen in their life, events occur, environmental, things happen in a sense that make them feel pessimistic, hopeless about the future, don't believe that things could get better. And then they start showing the signs of lots of anxiety and depression. Mm-hmm. Whereas the next person might have a predisposition to quite a bit of anxiety or depression, but work through it by noticing how their mind works. So, everybody uses the term more and more these days, mindfulness. So they might notice, I worry a lot. So that might be like the brain is trying to worry. It's making us worry. It's wanting to be, I guess a good term, vigilant, hyper vigilant to possible mm-hmm. things that could go wrong. And then like you were saying, then you just fit into it. Oh my God, maybe I won't get to work on time. And then, oh my God, at work, I'm worried that the boss doesn't like me anymore. And then, like whatever there is to worry about, they will slot in the things that are in front of them. But when they start to notice they do that, then they can say, well, why do I worry so much? Like, is it working for me? And back to kind of what we talked before, is it effective? Do I want to worry so much? And then they might choose to not go to worrying. And then, this is a very hopeful thing they call neuroplasticity, that the brain will change. So you start noticing that you worry a lot, but then you practice not worrying and not, ruminating about stuff that could go wrong. And you do something else. Let's say you start to worry and you say, no, I'm worrying. I'm going to just listen to the music and drive to work. I'm not going to think about all the things that could go wrong. It's a
significant amount of people that go through therapy or self-reflection that can actually make these changes.
Well, I think we're all in the same boat, really. Like we all could, if we start to notice that we have patterns like of worrying or negative thinking, feeling hopeless about stuff, then we can own it, see it, not blame ourselves for it, and then start to think, well, I don't want to worry so much, and then find a way not to worry. And then the brain actually changes. It's like the circuits are all in there, right? Just like how a computer might have all these circuits or neuron connections between different parts of the brain. And the one that goes to the fear part, which is, the old brain, kind of the reptilian brain, where all the fear is, it starts not going there because you refuse or you choose not to go towards fear. And then it won't be so hard after you do it because you create a new pathway.
Yeah.
And that's, that's a real, when that people started talking about that, was like a really good step in the direction of hopefulness, that we're not just stuck in these bodies and brains and that we were predisposed to be a certain kind of person. We can actually rewire our brain. And in a sense, you could say change your personality, right? I mean, if we think of personality as tendencies of behavior, a real worrier, well, maybe we started as a worrier, but we actually rewired our brain. And in the end, we might be calmer than, the average, much calmer than the average person. How did we do that? Through this practice of mindfulness that leads to actual material changes in the brain.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to hear you say that, because I have heard that, put forth before that these traits are stable, but it doesn't coincide with my own experience. Like I've found that certainly there's times in my life where I felt more stressed and less stressed. I mean, everybody has stress all the time, but it didn't match my experience. So that's interesting.
It's hopeful that we can make changes and not feel stuck, get stuck in our identity. But you mentioned something else. I mean, what my favorite topic these days is the idea of the old brain. Have you heard that?
I have, yeah.
And then people use like reptilian brain or, anyways, the way I've heard the triune brain, there's three main, I'm not really, a neuroscientist in any way. What I picked up on, and I usually is more the practice of people trying to change their feelings and their behaviors. But I've this idea that the triune, there's like the old brain and the reptilian brain. As it evolved, it became more complex emotionally. And then the frontal lobes developed and evolved. And you could just say that it seems to me one of the biggest problems that we have as humans is the interface between the old brain and the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe can like analyze things, make, question, risk, is there risk here? Okay, I want to do this behavior. Like I want to jump out of a plane with a parachute on. Whereas the old brain would say, no way.
Yeah.
Right?
You're having to fight your body.
Exactly.
I guess you're not fighting your body, you're fighting your brain. Because your body's only responding to your different parts of your brain.
Yeah, and somehow we override it, like your old brain. Even I'm sure I've never jumped out of a plane. I would like to, but I just haven't.
I have. It was tricky.
Yeah. So you must know that. And when you went to jump that first time, was your heart pounding and your brain was sort of telling you, don't do that?
Yeah, for sure. So I do a lot of these extreme sports, what people would call extreme sports. But I've never been that interested in bungee jumping and skydiving. But both of them I've done through a bit of a coincidence. I used to work at a resort that had a bungee jump tower, so we could just do it whenever we wanted to. Right. So I felt obligated to do it a few times. And then my friend went bungee jumping or skydiving for his birthday. But I found bungee jumping a lot scarier than skydiving. And now you're attached to another person when you're skydiving, so I guess you have that support. I don't think that influenced me. I think it goes back to the old brain, what you were talking about. With skydiving, it was like an abstraction. Like we're so high up, I don't think my old brain even really recognized the scenario that I was in because it's so unfamiliar.
Okay.
Whereas bungee jumping, I was 150 feet above the ground. I've been on cliffs that high. And like it's a familiar setting, which I know I've come close to dying, before like that, and then to hurl yourself off of that, and with a string attached to yourself, like it just seems so stupid.
And so in that case, I imagine your old brain knows that this is dangerous, and and actually they proved that in psychology that we're born with an awareness that heights are dangerous. So it was like a classic study where they take an infant and they had it on a glass table, but it won't crawl over the edge because it can see the drop off. It's not taught. Yeah. So it's inherent in the old brain to avoid falling off things. Yeah, so the old brain
precognition.
Yeah, it's built in like an instinct, to be fearful. So fear in a sense evolved to protect us. And so when you look at the old brain, it's full of fear, right? And what I've really noticed is working with people, fear is the main issue, the main problem. It turns into so many other emotions that we find troubling. But it is sort of created by the old brain. Supposedly, I suppose, in time, in millions of years of evolution, it evolved to protect us. And, so anything that was threatening to us, we would have fear would be created, which was like a chemical reaction. It's just a chemical reaction occurring in the brain to try and make us not do the thing, avoid the thing, whatever it might be. Yeah. And yet, so when you've got this fear comes up and then we avoid things and then we try other responses when we're afraid, like anger, which was another thing that was selected for by the brain to try and solve the problem. of being attacked or whatever. So you're at threat, anger kicks in.
It's almost like fear plus adrenaline.
Yeah.
Plus determination equals anger or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like fear is the base emotion that is created by the old brain. And then various other emotions kind of come from that. Like, we're afraid to be alone. So we experience, because if you were alone, you might die. So if you're going to be in a group and you're cut off from the group, you're going to die. So if you felt you're alone and you feel fear, then you would go back to the group. Mm-hmm. But another feeling that
like loneliness would be a type of fear.
Yeah, well, in a sense, maybe it's another feeling that was developed by the brain to make you join the group.
Yeah.
So that I was like, oh, I feel really uncomfortable on my own. And we say it's loneliness as if it has this complex thing, but we could reduce it to a kind of a chemical thing that's occurring that makes us feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, and I guess where it gets complex too is that the old brain and our cognition, they interface. And so maybe if you're separated from a group, it would make sense that you have a loneliness reaction immediately, but then you could also be with an abusive partner, for example, and not be left alone, but cognitively understand that if I were to make decision XYZ, I would be alone. And then that fear from the old brain could kick in based not on a real stimulus, but based on a simulation you've run in your cognition.
Right. Yeah. I mean, why do people do certain things? Like you're saying, like if you're in an abusive relationship, if you leave, your old brain may feel like you're going to be cut off from connection, but you also may be cut off from sustenance or whatever if you're going to have to be out on your own. Mm-hmm. So there's fears make people do things that are maybe like counterproductive, certainly as humans now. Animals, a lot of it was just like automatic. So you go out of your little, let's say you're a reptile, and you go out of your little cave and some rocks come down a hill and they cover you and you're almost killed. Your brain will remember everything about that experience, like the sunlight, where it was, where you were in relation to your cave, and it will remember it perfectly, so that you stay away from that area and avoidance of that area. Unfortunately for humans now, we get traumatic things happening all the time, like an abusive relationship or like a loss of a job or somebody. Loss of a relationship, breakdowns of and then
although primitive human beings would probably have the same thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have much more complex experiences of it, but the brain might tell you stay away, so don't ever go into a relationship again because it was so painful. And yet that would be, if we generalize and say don't go to a relationship, then we would avoid, other positive things that might happen through connection.
Because one of the things I've thought about before is like how amazingly complex the human brain is, and it's almost, you'd think about it if one believes in evolution, how you adapt to do what's necessary to survive. The power of the human brain seems unnecessary. But my thought is that like in the modern world, there's a lot of complexity with technology, but in any job, no matter how complex it is, often the most, like if you talk to Elon Musk, I wonder if the most complex things he deals with is all these inventions or trying to manage all the people and conflicting interests in these companies. I don't know the answer, but I could guess at it. I bet you it's not coming up with the ideas. It's trying to get people to do it and to buy in and to work and his personal relationships. So I would imagine it's like a primitive society. Their social networks would be just as complex in that the human brain kind of maybe evolved to deal with that situation and survive in that. Because, there's a lot more successful hunting species that are more successful than us that are a lot stupider than us.
Well, I guess you might say, what is stupid though, right?
That's right.
If we were in that society, hunters, gatherers, and with the extreme lack of knowledge that we have on how to do that, we might look really stupid.
Yeah,
we wouldn't know how to get an animal or get do the kill or survive in the. But I think a good point you're saying in the sense. Our brains evolved and our bodies evolved for, millions of years. I'm not sure how many exact years. I always forget how many years we've actually been on the planet. But and only in the last few hundred years have we changed so radically. So, or a few thousand years, let's say. Before that, we were hunters and gatherers, and for many,
but we had the same cognitive capacity, essentially identical, right?
I think that's evolved somewhat, but they think that we developed the frontal lobes because it was good for imagining things. Like it gave you an advantage, like in a hunt, because you could imagine what it would happen. So a lot of things were for basic survival things, like to deal with, become a better hunter, to be successful, to survive and procreate. That's the whole thing with evolution. Yeah. If you can survive it, to procreate, you will pass those genes on. And then so that kind of behavior,
also you have to survive and procreate, and perhaps the procreation was the more like neurologically taxing thing.
You know what I mean? Like in what way?
Well, like if it might actually be trivial to conduct a hunt and get enough food to survive, but to manage all the relationships within your tribe and to attract a mate who maybe is predisposed to like more attractive males, like if that was sexually selected for. I've heard that theory before, that the brain could actually, like the human brain could be from a sexual adaptation pressure, not like a natural selection adaptation pressure, if that makes any sense.
Well, my understanding is that, basically natural selection is that anything that will lead you to pass your genes on will be selected, because it's almost like a logic.
So it encompass both.
Yeah, it can. It's a logic that is almost infallible, because if the body and the brain evolved that way, it must have been effective. And so whatever, with alterations or along the way, anything that slightly gives you an advantage to procreate successfully will then be passed on. So. As you're saying, we start maybe like food and shelter, and all, but then the complexity of relationships, who gets to procreate, and what is considered attractive, and so like this in sociobiology, one of the things that say that people like men might be attracted to hips. Now we think that's because it's aesthetically pleasing, but actually bigger hips means more effective childbirth. Right. So we tend to think we like that for some aesthetic reason. It's just beauty, when it's actually based on just that if you chose that, that gene will be passed on for the one that made you choose the hips.
Yeah.
So it's a very weird logic. But what I've noticed in therapy, just to bring it back to therapy, is that the old brain we all have an old brain. We carry it around with us. It's not very smart in the sense that it doesn't have language. It's pre-verbal.
Okay.
So you can't speak to your old brain. So it has fear, and you can't talk to it. You can't, as we're talking now, the old brain is just sitting here looking for things to go wrong, right? It doesn't understand language, although we can communicate to it, I think, more through so that we say, there's something dangerous happening, which circuits might go to the old brain, get it fired up. But it's sitting there and it has all this fear. And if you can't speak to it and you can't change it that way, then you have to show it that things are not dangerous. Okay. You have to actually bring the old brain yourself to do things that it's saying don't do. And then when you do it, that you override it with your frontal lobe. Eventually it calms down and says, I guess I can do that. And we do that with a lot. We're not, we instinctually don't like water, heights, fire, small spaces, insects, all these things, but we choose to go towards them. And if you choose with commitment, like, no, I want to go swimming, and you do it a few times, your frontal lobe can override the old brain very quickly if you're determined. Because it doesn't understand it. And when you choose to do it anyways, it goes, there's some kind of a mechanism that says, okay, let's take that off the list of things to avoid.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a powerful thing to be able to override something like that in your life. I always respect somebody that's facing their fears that way. Like one of my favorite things, one of my jobs in university before I got in the military was a raft guide.
Right.
And we had this like 20-foot cliff that jumped into not a rapid, but like some quickly moving deep water.
Right.
And it was terrifying for some people. And of course, some people just like jump up, do flips and that. Right. But one of my favorite things is getting some like middle-aged woman up there who's never done anything like that, and their knees are almost buckling and they're standing there shaking, and convincing them to actually like jump off. Or often if you go with them, people will do that more often. If you can't convince them to go by themselves, I'll hold your hand and we'll go together. They'll do that.
So people are, like you're saying, they're willing to do it. On some they're really going against sort of the nature of their old brain, which is trying to tell them to avoid it. But on some deeper level, they kind of know that they don't want to listen to that, right?
Yeah, they definitely want to do it because they've stood in line. Like I would never, like if somebody wasn't standing in line to jump off the cliff, I would never go pull them out of some hangout area and say like, you're getting up there and we're jumping. But somebody, if they've stood in line and they've waited, because there might be 100 people on this trip, and they've waited 5 minutes to get to the edge of the cliff, I generally put a lot of pressure on these people to like, oh, let's do it. Come on, you're not going to turn around. And once in a while you'd lose out and somebody would turn around, but almost every time you'd be able to coerce this person. And a lot of social, I don't know about social pressure, but social support. Like people would clap and cheer them on. And it was like it was a supportive environment as you get when you're with 100 strangers,
So and I hear what you're saying. I mean, that's very similar in a way to therapy, because, they know on some deeper level, or there is some awareness that if I can do this, I won't have this fear anymore. Mm-hmm. And it seems to be contrary to what the old brain is telling them, though. The old brain is saying, don't do this. And yet they're overriding that, and you're encouraging them, but they have consented, in a sense, to your encouragement for choosing to do this. Mm-hmm. They know that your goal is to support them to do the thing they wanted to do. So you're not really, as you said, the word coercing, but you're not really, because you're encouraging and you're trying to speak to their frontal lobe, which is saying, I want to do this.
And they've got all this evidence in their new brain or cognitive brain, because generally these people don't rush to the front of the line, right? They kind of meander and mill about until the line fills up and everybody goes, and they kind of get in the back of the line. So by the time they're standing at the edge of the cliff, they've seen 60, 70 people jump off of it before them, and all of them swim to shore with smiles on their faces. So they have all the evidence and all the data in front of them they need that they're going to be totally safe. But they do have to override that system.
And, we all know that in some level, like it's part of our culture, the expression, if you get thrown off a horse, get back on the saddle. We know that if you got thrown off a horse, there's a risk that you would turn away from riding again, and that would settle in and you'd never ride again. But people who ride love it so much that it became a kind of a saying, get back on the horse. Mm-hmm. And then once you do that, you are using your frontal lobe to override fear, and it works. And that's what's, what's so exciting about it in some ways, is that if you see fear as, in a sense, a delusion, because fear is never, in a sense, it's warning you against something that isn't happening now. Like, if you're being chased by a bear, even, fear is telling you something terrible is going to happen when it gets to you. Yeah.
When you're being mauled by a bear, you probably aren't feeling fear. It's a different set of emotions. Yeah.
And if you're running away from a bear, I don't run away from bears. I'm attracted to them. But if you're running away from a bear, you know that you don't want the bear. It could hurt you. So you don't need to be reminded of it the whole time.
Yeah, you don't need a debate with that part of your brain.
And you don't need any further, like adrenaline. I mean, you might need adrenaline. And luckily, we can have adrenaline, like athletes can have, without fear. So they can be in like a heightened state, but not have the fear part. Mm-hmm. But I think sometimes we think we need fear to keep us safe. So the funny contradiction in therapy is that you can ask people, what would happen if you worried less? And you can see that they're not absolutely sure they want to worry less. You know, and you can tell often people's eyes will go up to the left and kind of look up. And they're like thinking, I don't know, if I didn't have fear, I'd be vulnerable to some terrible things. But I think that is what makes people hang on to fear. Like they don't want to turn away from it. And they do think, I think we all think that somehow without fear, we would forget, you know, not to drive too fast, or we would forget to pay our bills, and which I don't think makes a lot of sense.
No.
The frontal lobe is really good at...
Those are cognitive tasks.
Yeah, and the frontal lobe is very good at assessing risk, right? And if we listen to the old brain, we wouldn't even want to get in a car because it'd be like, don't do this.
And the old brain doesn't understand statistics, right? Like, you know, if talk about how many measures we put against child abductions for strangers, whereas like that just really doesn't happen. All these child abductions are from close family members and all that. Like, but the old brain doesn't understand that, right? The old brain, from you know what you've said and from what I understand about the little I understand about psychology, is it doesn't process statistics. It just sees a risk, and you know, if there's no immediate reward, it just wants to avoid the risk, right?
And we know that if you face, as you were saying, face fear, you get over it. And, you know, when I was working, I've been working a lot with people who have PTSD. And I was also working with teenagers who had anxiety problems. And the common thing I started to notice is that people had a funny relationship with anxiety. In one way, if they had, let's say, anxiety, they won't go to school. So they're not going to, teenagers are not going to go to school because they've had some bad experiences. They're very anxious. But if you said to them, you know, would you like to get over your anxiety? Then they might think, well, then I'd be at school.
Yeah.
But when you say, no, I didn't say you had to go back to school. I said, would you like to get over your anxiety about school? There's some kind of funny logic thing. Like, for instance, I always tell this story to my clients. I have my niece, who was like maybe 13 or 14 at the time. She's one of those people, you've probably seen them, you know, are really afraid of wasps.
Okay.
So she's, you know, we're walking down the street or something. The wasp comes near, and she's, you know, that thing where people just go, ah, you know, they just curl up and they're like, ah, and they look like, oh my God, you're really terrified right now.
Yeah.
So I asked her later, I said, hey, would you like to get over that fear of wasps? And she said, no.
Yeah.
And it just bing, right? Oh, right. We think fear is keeping us safer, but actually it's creating all sorts of trouble in our life. Like we're hanging on to fear as if it's protecting us.
Crouching up like that is not more effective defense against wasps.
Yeah. And I suppose the old brain's logic is maybe if you stay in the house for the rest of your life, you're going to have less likelihood of being stung, which might be 1% better or than going outside. But the loss of not being able to go outside is much greater. But I noticed that with PTSD and anxiety, people have a funny unconscious relationship sometimes of wanting not to let go of the distress and anxiety, because then they'll have to face whatever they were traumatized by. So there's a funny thing about that. The only way they seem to be effective at doing it is when they want to.
Okay.
And that's the tricky part. So, and I was noticing that with teenagers a lot, and I would say, you know, what would you like? You know, the narrative view, what would you like? I like to stay home. Okay. And I liked my parents to stop bothering me about school. Okay. So that, and then what? And then, you know, if you really listen to them and see if you can set up what they want, and you can, then they say, like, I remember this kid, I said, okay, now you're at home. Now you're living in actually a trailer outside in the front driveway. Your parents aren't bugging you anymore. You're not having to go to school. So, you know, things have gone.
This is all hypothetical.
Yeah, well, this was actually happening.
This
person.
is happening. Okay.
Yeah, this is a real person. I won't mention their name, of course.
But I mean, this scenario where they're living in a trailer, has that actually been set up for them, or are you going through this as an exercise?
No, sorry. Yeah, they did have a trailer in their driveway, and they were living there. and that was better than being in the house because there was so much tension about them not going to school. And so they got what they wanted. But then I said, so what now? And they said, well, I'm not going to live at home for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
So it was so interesting that the story, they got what they wanted to avoid all the anxiety, but when it really came down, they realized that wasn't going to solve the underlying problem. So then they chose to try and overcome some of these debilitating fears. But when people try and push you towards it, the old brain kicks in and it says, no way am I going to school, or am I going back to work, or am I going, like, it really kicks in when you're being pressured to go towards the thing that you're fearful of.
So and you mentioned PTSD as well. What is often like the underlying trigger for PTSD or anxiety? Like how do these things generally begin manifesting?
Well, there's a good story that fits with this and what we're just talking about too, because actually, a lot of times, like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, some trauma in your life, the obvious one is something like war, but it could be a car accident, it could be a breakup even, it could be an illness, a severe illness. Your old brain records that as a very traumatic event and will do everything it can to protect you from doing that again. So it will make you, in a sense, avoid everything to do with what you experience. So with a car accident, you won't want to get in a car. It'll record the sounds of the street, the street lights and everything will all be triggers for you. And your old brain will say, bingo, this is the dangerous area.
Yeah.
And then it'll say, don't go do it. But then, of course, if you can't get in a car again, you've got this other problem and your life gets smaller and smaller. So how do you overcome that kind of your brain wanting to avoid things?
So what do you think of when people talk about, say, triggering? Like I've heard that word before, like that's triggering to me.
Yeah.
If you look at the model you've kind of put about exposure, like small exposures or greater exposures to what you are fearing being kind of the antidote to that, do you think this is actually maladaptive to protect people and put trigger warnings on everything to kind of, wouldn't that actually increase their anxiety or make them more reclusive if they were afraid of these triggers?
Like, sorry, what you're saying, like a warning, like I heard they put warnings on, what are those things people are really big on eating these days, on toast? I can't remember and they cut them up and they put them on toast, but I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the vegetable. But
avocado.
Avocado.
Yeah.
So anyways, in England, I heard that they put a warning sign on it because people cut them open with a knife and they often cut their fingers and stuff. So it says right on them, dangerous. Avocados are dangerous. But that's what you mean, like all these warning signs out there.
Well, and just like, I guess I'm thinking kind of for somebody that had, say, like issues with their race or their sex, or the best example would be, say, a woman who's been raped. There might be like triggers to that experience, could be like a strong male presence or some sort of aggression or talks about sexual violence or whatever it would be. So you are, to prevent that person from being emotionally around, you're triggered and ultimately scared and want to leave whatever space you're in. You try to protect that person, but in protecting them, you might actually be stifling their growth by creating this environment where they're never exposed to those things and they never have a chance to actually slowly reintegrate into like a normal human experience.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It can get help protecting children from fears or things that are troubling them can counterproductive, like, because when we talk about overprotecting and then they don't go towards the thing that and so it is a weird thing. Of course, we want to avoid bad experiences. We want to avoid real danger. We don't want to do things that are too risky. Although some people want to, they might take high risk. They might actually, they know they could get hurt. Not most people don't want to do that if they know they're going to get hurt. But we want to be able to be free of false, worries or fears that are unfounded. And so it is true that, like you were saying, in therapy, one of the like really proven approach to fear, anxiety is the exposure idea. That if you're afraid of spiders, you might look at pictures of spiders first, and then maybe a fake spider, and then be in a room where there's a spider, and eventually get up to picking up the spider, and then you get over it. So they call it progressive desensitization.
Although I guess the thing with that is the willingness, the patient is willingly going into that, not being pulled into that by an external force.
That is the key thing. You nailed it there. That's what I've noticed. And that's what in my practice, I focus on that idea that people have to decide to go towards it themselves. So I was noticing that with teenagers who really they just decide, no way, I'm not going to go to school. I'm not going to, and then you can't really discuss it with them because they might think you're just trying to push them to go back. And it's hard to, so you have to find a way for them to make a decision themselves about whether they want to get over the fear. When I was doing that kind of work, I came across this study which really affirmed that. It was a study done in England, and they had all these military people who had been over in Afghanistan or something, and they had PTSD, so they're very sensitive to like sounds like cars backfiring, any sirens. They're reliving a lot of these things. They can't watch TV if they see violence. It all comes back, but they wanted to get over the symptoms of PTSD, all this anxiety, this constant anxiety in their life. They often get really reactive to people, angry, lots of anxiety. So they want to get over it. So they went and volunteered for this study that was offered. And in this study, what they did is they asked people to choose videos of things that would be really traumatizing for them, like the back streets of Afghanistan, or pictures of a tank, or sounds too. So like the sounds of gunfire. And then they tell them, in the study where I read the study, it doesn't say exactly how they inform them, but they basically say, this is what we're going to ask you to do. If you go towards these things, then they won't be triggers anymore.
Yeah.
And they convince them, but one thing, as you mentioned already, they want to do it.
Yeah.
That's a key thing. They want to do it. So they're like, sure, bring it on. I want to do the thing that will make me better. So they have a rationalization, and they're being encouraged that, yes, you can get over this. So they get the videos together. The person chooses themselves, I think. So they're sort of like, this is triggering, this is... So they're in control of the process too, right? So they're actually not feeling forced into it. They're choosing to be part of the process. And then they have the videos and the sounds, and they get on a treadmill, and they walk towards it, the videos.
Oh, interesting.
And I think the key part there, like we were talking about, is that the old brain doesn't have language, so you can't talk to it. You have to show it.
Right. So it wouldn't be helpful if you were sitting in a chair and pushing yourself into the back of the chair. That could actually be encouraging the old brain that this is something we need to slink away from and hide from and make ourselves small.
Exactly. You could, if the person was still very terrified and you said, here, we're going to play these videos, it's going to be good for you. You could re-traumatize them, as they're like, no, what are you doing to me? But if they're choosing it, then their frontal lobe, I picture the frontal lobe is overriding the old brain's automatic responses. So they're looking at it, and because the treadmill makes the old brain understand the movement towards, they're choosing it through walking. Not only if they just sat there and put it on, they're actually physically walking, and so the old brain recognizes. But it's obviously not very smart because it doesn't understand that it's not the real thing, and you're on a treadmill. It just thinks, oh, we're moving towards a thing, so this must be okay. Or luckily for evolution, not luckily, the evolution works that way. If you couldn't override your old brain, it wouldn't be. It's a good thing that you can override it sometimes.
Yeah. Well, what a perfect I don't know. Analogy is not the right word, but it's great, like a layered kind of approach to that. You're both physically and mentally moving towards or advancing towards something that you're terrified of.
Yeah. And that is the message that evolution has allowed the old brain to be overridden. is when there's choice and personal agency. I want to do this. The old brain, somehow it evolved in such a way that, okay, that's a trigger to turn, trigger, I shouldn't say use trigger, but it's a step or a lever or lever is switched, to say, now the fear can be removed from the list of things I'm trying to avoid.
Now I'm just going through all the things we could get on the TV while and get a treadmill, and all of a sudden, yeah.
Well, that's a good point. I in my own life, when I'm looking at this whole old brain fear thing, I've kind of thought, whenever I realize I have fear, that it'll be useful to go towards it. If it's a fear that I'm, if you think you're going to go to a party, most people have some social anxiety that when they get to the party, something is going to be stressful. So they're kind of, part of them is avoiding it. But if you say, oh, no, this will be good. I want to go to the party, to face that fear, just the choice, conscious choice. No. Yeah. And you say, I want to go, not I have to go, or
right. Yeah.
And you say, I'm going to go and face that fear. It works because you've overridden it by just making it very conscious that you want to go towards the thing that part of you is trying to get away from.
Yeah. So that's that passage of information between like the physical world and the cognitive brain and the old brain.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. And that's like kind of you can talk a lot about free will, but and some people don't believe in free will, but that does seem to me like a demonstration of at least perception of free will over just like the drive of the basic, old brain to survive and avoid fearful stimulus. Was there you notice a theme in, say, parenting that would lead to these high anxiety children?
Yeah, and family therapy is fascinating in itself, but what I noticed a lot was that when there is an anxious child, let's say they're biologically predisposed to be anxious, and then the parent wants them to get over it. So the parent will try to get them to do things, or they'll push them in the direction of facing their fears. But the old brain kicks in big time at that point. The old brain does not like to be forced into things, which is perfectly understandable, right? Yeah. Like we don't like to be held, we'll panic, right? Like in animals, like if you hold an animal, it panics because that could be dangerous, right? You're being caught and you could be killed. Yeah. So we don't like that. And we don't like somebody sort of forcing us towards something. The old brain will experience that as very dangerous. So parents are anxious and fearful, and they want their kids to do things and to get over problems, but they're trying to push them in that direction. And then the kid, it's a healthy response to resist them.
Right.
And
so these kind of types of anxiety, could they be nipped in the bud earlier if the parents were actually not so insistent about them getting over these things? Or do you think like that is kind of a chicken and the egg type thing where there's a little bit of anxiety where somebody wants to miss school for a day and the parents put up that strong wall of no, absolutely go back, and then that dynamic builds? Is that typically how it happens?
No, I think that's a good description. Like if a child had a tendency to be anxious and wanted to avoid school, and the parent was afraid that if they didn't go to school and communicated that fear and then didn't listen to that possibility, they might add to the fear, right? Because the old brain will kick in thinking, I'm being forced to do something which seems dangerous or uncomfortable. And then the child would be even more insistent not to be forced to do the thing. I mean, it's tricky, I think, for parents, because it doesn't mean they're going to say, oh, I don't want to go to school today, Mom. And you're like, okay, you don't have to.
Yeah.
There's a point where they might, but if we have, too much pushing and too much saying this is good for you, actually backfires. And I mean, we're kind of talking about another topic which I find fascinating, parenting, right? It seems to have shifted a lot, where the parents would tell everybody, the parents were in charge and tell you how to live your life. And now it's kind of like a revolution from the bottom up. The kids watching cartoons and movies and all sorts of empowering sort of messages. They're saying, no, you can't tell me how to live my life. So the parents are using more, sometimes parents are using more of power tactics to overcome their kids' what they would call opposition, or, you know, not being a good listener, or being, you know, acting a delinquent.
Opposition, like this, you know, opposition from the youth, is that a healthy thing for society, or do you think that's counterproductive?
Well, it's, you know, I think to me, there is kind of a paradigm shift is occurring from that power over others. It might work well at times in the military, or when you're trying to solve problems, you might have a hierarchical arrangement works best. But there's a guy who wrote a book called Conscious Loving, and he states the obvious. He sort of says, why did we have to have power in families? Why is there a hierarchy? Mm-hmm. Why do we need that? Where did we get the idea that the parents are in charge and they should use power over their kids to, you know, sort of bring them up properly? And he said, it's like, he puts it in such a good way that, what are we trying to do? We're trying to get our kids to be mature and cooperate and learn and take responsibility. Why do we need power to do that, rather than collaboration and you know, kind of some children want to be part of the family, and they're willing to do some things, but then the parents, we step in and we force them, and we make it a big issue about power and control. So then the kids take on, you know, it's a power struggle. But I think the parents introduce the concept of power as the way to get people to grow up or to mature. Yeah. And then they're upset that their kids are in a power struggle with them.
Right.
But they introduced
they're the
power
ones that introduced it into the dynamic. Yeah.
And now there seems to be a paradigm shift away from power as the way to influence people to shared understanding and collaboration. How do we get people who live in the same house to cooperate and to share some of the work, and to understand that parents have huge demands and they need help and they need some cooperation.
Yeah. And there's actually you mentioned the military. That paradigm shift is happening in the military as well. In the military. Well, yeah, certainly. Because, I mean, if power is a strange thing, right? Like, you might have the illusion of power when you're in a large military organization that hasn't been deployed, because, you know, somebody's job, and depending if it's 1930, maybe their next meal, it depends on them still being in the military. So you have some power and influence over somebody. But the second you're in the desert in Afghanistan with a crew of 12 people, or a platoon of 30 guys, or a better example is Vietnam, with a remote operating platoon in the jungles of Vietnam. The platoon commander on paper has all the power over his soldiers. He can command them into death. But I don't have the statistics on me, but there was a lot of platoon commanders executed by their own soldiers in the jungles of Vietnam. So what does power mean in that situation, right? I think like that comes into leadership. And like that guy, if he wants to get his mission accomplished and if he wants to survive, he needs to use good leadership, and he needs to use, maybe not necessarily bargaining, but he needs to inspire people to have a common purpose and to do what needs to be done to, you know, for them all to make it out of the jungle alive, right? And that's certainly where the military is moving with, like, they call it a contiguous battlefield, where the enemy is not clear. It's not clear where he's coming from. It's not clear what his intentions necessarily are, because they're very operating in cells, and they try to give the most autonomy to the lowest level, right? Rather than telling, you know, because there's all the tiers of hierarchy, they try to give the lower levels, like one person will usually have 3 subgroups under them, and that kind of cascades down. They'll make their intentions clear and what they want to happen, but they won't say, you need to do this to make what I want happen. They'll generally say, this is what I want happening. This is kind of how I see you achieving it, but you need to make your intention clear, because the situation is going to change so quickly. The people below you need to be empowered to operate independently and still get your mission done.
Right.
Right.
So they sort of belief in the person's abilities rather than having to tell them how to act, because in those difficult moments nobody can tell you how to act. You have to make the decisions yourself.
You have to kind of believe in the mission statement and believe that's what's gonna win or get them out alive.
And that's similar to parenting. Like, if we're going to tell our kids how to behave and how to act and everything, and when they can't, they won't be doing it for themselves. So that true maturity is when you start to make decisions yourself. So I'm hoping, like, the old style of parenting and sort of making children act a certain way to help them grow up. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
People get it. And it's funny because I have clients who tell me something like, well, I deserved, every discipline I got. I'm like, really? Did you really? But sometimes we buy into it, and retrospectively we think, well, maybe I must have been a terrible kid because I got beaten.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, the system of power over you was what was terrible, not you. But
it must be really hard if you, like, I imagine a lot of times you have a child who, they have certain genetic predispositions to anxiety or what, and there's just a tough situation.
Right.
But it must be tough for you when there's a kid that you can clearly see where their parent, and the parents have demanded, and you can just clearly see all the faults in the parent, and this is just like maybe a really likable kid that you get along with, and that must be a hard situation.
It is. And actually, when family therapy first was developed and created back in kind of the 60s, I think, or one of the terms they used is when the family came in, they had the IP, or identified patient, was the person who the family said was ill. So I like the way that's the IP, that's the identified patient, but that doesn't mean they're the ill ones.
Right.
It could be the family dynamic has created that person as the person who's being blamed for the problems, or being told they have a problem. And so to look at it that way, you're kind of thinking of it more like a system problem, not the individual. So the IP was just the person that the system is defined as being ill.
Have you ever encountered somebody in therapy that you've come to believe is just like a bad person? Like, not just bad at being a person, but they have, like, they enjoy seeing other people suffer, and there's no amount of like counseling or talking through their problems that's going to make this person somebody that you're going to be, excited about saying, yeah, this was a client of mine, and now look at them,
Well, that's a good, that's a whole area of study that I haven't read a lot about, but it's still controversial. Like, whether there are people, called, let's say, sociopaths, or another term is psychopath. So a person perhaps who doesn't have the ability to empathize with others. And the reason I think it's controversial, it should be controversial because it's not black or white, right? I mean, it's either some people have, it's not like some people have no empathy and then other people have empathy. It's a spectrum, yeah. And so some people, and somebody who doesn't seem to have empathy may be able to develop empathy, and it might look like somebody who's been really abused doesn't seem to have empathy, but it's because of their experiences. But it's also possible there are some people born with the biological, built into them, aren't capable of understanding other people's feelings and awareness from their perspective. But I always find it really a controversial subject, because sometimes if you think it's just a label, then if somebody's difficult, that person's a sociopath, and then there's like, they can't be changed.
Right.
Therapy can't change them. They're born that way. So it's a risky thing to, if you're going to use that category, to make sure that it makes sense and that that you haven't mislabeled somebody and given up on them.
So have you had this type of person as a patient before?
I when I think back, I don't know if I have. I think there's people that you really worry about that, but if anybody, and people that stay with therapy probably do have some sense of empathy, because they want to resolve something in themselves. It's the people who never come in for therapy, maybe, who maybe don't have any, they don't think they have a problem because they're not aware of how they might be hurting others, or they're not concerned about, just, they might not have a sense of ethics or morality that kind of comes from empathy.
Okay.
So those people might not show up on your doorstep.
So even if those people, like they say, their relationships have all deteriorated and they have addictions, or they just don't think that changing something within their self could solve that. They also maybe would have is it generally correlated to external locus of control with sociopathy? Well,
that's a good term. I talked about that earlier, right? Internal locus being that I can change myself inside. External being I'll change things on the outside, and that's where I can control. I don't know. Like I said, I haven't done a lot of studying on that. I think what I understand is that sometimes without empathy, you can be freed up to do a lot of manipulative things.
Yeah, for sure.
You might be very effective in certain professions, or you might be really good at, you might be good at crime or something because you're not concerned about the victims.
Yeah. Certainly, there's lots of you hear about these opportunistic criminals who do stupid things and get caught, but there's also so many opportunities that are presented just in, I'm assuming, everybody's life, where it's you could do this and you'd certainly get away with it. There's only serial killers, is a good example. I just watched the show Mindhunter. Have you seen that on Netflix? No. Oh, it's a CIA, go find a kind of developing profiles of serial killers and interviewing them. But
right.
They're it's if you get in a disagreement with your spouse and you decide to murder your spouse, you're probably going to be caught, right? You have to cover. But if you just decide, I'm going to go kill somebody, and you rant, that would be exceptionally hard to catch somebody, right?
Right.
It's very easy to get away with that kind of thing. Or if you,
and it's so outside of most people's understanding. What are they getting out of it, right? What kind is a person like that born where they would find some reward, some thrill, where most people are horrified by the idea because, it's our human nature, I think, to have some compassion to other people. It's built into us,
Yeah.
And yet maybe there are some people, I don't know, how many, and I think that's what we have to be careful, because then we can start thinking somebody's a sociopath, so you just write them off. And people sometimes throw it around in a very light way. Oh, yeah, my ex-wife was a sociopath or something.
Yeah.
Really?
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Now, the other thing I'm curious about is when you have, it must be a great feeling, the departure of some, a client, when they actually leave and finish therapy. How does that affect your mental state? And similarly, it must be so draining talking to people all day about their problems. Does that affect your mood? And how do you avoid bringing that home?
Good question. I mean, both of them. So the first one, it's really extremely rewarding doing this work. And I have to be honest with you, I didn't find it as rewarding at the beginning. I was more interested I was just fascinated by people and their minds, and sometimes psychology seems interested. But I didn't really understand the reward that comes from when you actually help somebody and you see them. Then it's that felt satisfying. I felt like I was part of something that was pretty meaningful. I didn't really get that until I was doing it a lot. I didn't, it wasn't I want to go out there and help people.
Yeah.
I mean, it might have been in me somewhat, right? And we all have that, and rewarding, to do that. But it was when I saw what happens when somebody does get better and that you've helped them, then there's this sense that was meaningful for sure.
Yeah. I like that because in the military, I think everybody likes to think they're part of something and doing something meaningful, but some people would have this. Often it'd be somebody that was not doing their job, but they would have this narrative I'm part of the military and I joined to serve my country. And it's let's be real for a second. We all joined because we did the calculation that you're going to give me X amount of benefits, X this, and here's the qualifications I need, and you're going to pay for my schooling in this order. Like, none of us are, like, I just don't believe your narrative. Like, and do you really believe it? Because if you believe it, we've got problems.
All right. Yeah. That I really did this for my country.
Yeah, come on. Come on.
And yet, yeah, there's
But I think that does grow. Like, I'm not denying true heroism. Like, I certainly am not that. I was worked in the background in engineering and logistics, but there is guys that do incredibly heroic things. But I think those guys are generally doing it for like the team around them, not their country, not such an abstract idea.
Yeah. Camaraderie and a real empathy for others and wanting. Yeah. And I find that in the work. But one of the ways that I found like you said, the second part, burning out or feeling troubled by it, that can be part of this thing that ties into what we were talking about, the expert thing. Like, if you think you have the job of fixing people, then you kind of feel like, what am I going to do? And how do I say the right thing? And where am I, what is the thing that's going to make them change? And that actually is counter to what you want, because you want them to change. So you become more of a person on the sidelines saying, is this helping? Or what do you want to do? Where do you want to? So in a sense, you take the pressure off yourself because they have to make the changes. And the more you believe that, the less pressure is on you. All you can do is kind of create the conditions where they might look at themselves and make choices. So you don't carry it home as much. Like at the beginning, I know, I lie in bed, oh my God, did I ask them about suicidal ideation or something? Mm-hmm. And then
the onus is on them ultimately.
Well, generally, certainly today, if somebody started to say something that sounded like that, I would ask. But I'm not going to ask everybody and feel like I have to be responsible for every choice they make. Even if they're talking about something that had nothing to do with suicidal ideation, I don't feel like I have to make sure they don't do that behavior. So I don't take that on. I listen to them. What their issue is, and then ask them what they thought they could do and how they're going to resolve it. And then the therapy works, during that hour, let's say, and then I know I can't do more afterwards. They'll have to, next time we'll pick it up again. And so in that sense, I don't burn out, but there is times I have to, when you've seen somebody who's really been mistreated or been through terrible trauma of some sort, where you're going to empathize and feel it yourself, and then you're going to. But what I found sometimes is the worst ones, you get, 3 or 4 somewhere along the way that are really painful. And after that, you're a bit like, well, I can't, feeling depressed for them won't help me. I have to stay thinking about change and the possibilities of change and not get into that hopeless sense. So
because that's not helpful behavior, like that kind of Buddhist thing you were talking about.
If you focus on, this is terrible that people do this to each other, I mean, then you're going to get stuck in that thought, and you're going to carry that around. So you have to say, but people are healing and we're doing our best to heal, so I'm going to stay on that part of it. And then you can walk out of that saying, there, I did my best for that person during that time. And the world is full of, terrible trauma, war and rape and violence. But it's also, we're all trying to get through that, so you can focus on which narrative kind of, right? The narrative, like everything is going to the dogs, or we're trying our best to move forward. And that's kind of a choice. Which one will I listen to? Which story? And again, back to the narrative, which is more effective? If I focus on what's going wrong and all the things, will I be helping in the sense of trying to overcome it?
Yeah.
Not if I feel overwhelmed by it, but if I'm doing something about, well, I'll do my best with it, then all that story will motivate me to do more. So
I think that's a great place to leave it. I've kept you all night here, and I really appreciate you coming out. Do you have any closing remarks for people to think about narrative therapy, or even get in touch with you if they're interested in that in Victoria?
Well, I'm closing. I mean, I would say that the thing that I'm most interested in these days, that we were talking about a lot, is fear itself. Fear turns into anxiety, turns into depression, and if we look at fear in our life and we choose to kind of like go towards it, or the way I like to go, we have to go from avoidance of fear, which is what our old brain wants us to do, to a radically different position, which is bring it on.
Okay.
Right? Which is a great saying. In other words, if you bring it on, I can deal with that. It's a distortion, it's a delusion or an illusion, whatever you want to say. Fear isn't happening now. It's a thing that your brain is creating for you. But if you say, I've had it with fear, I'm going towards it, I'm going to embrace the things I've been avoiding, it will work after, 3 or 4 attempts. When you choose to go towards it, it will actually work. Your brain will stop, sending all this fear messages, alarm bells, going off, and you'll overcome.
Yeah. Well, that's a super positive message, really, because like you can't say that about dieting. It's like 3 or 4 attempts at dieting, and you'll be exactly in the right like. It's like,
your body won't absorb food.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It can be very optimistic amidst all the suffering around. There's another story that you can overcome a lot of it.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Tim, and I'd love to do this again.
Okay, that was great. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks for listening to my discussion with Tim. I found it very interesting how psychological counseling has generally moved from a more prescriptive approach to just active listening. And it's a great reminder for me to be a better listener. That's not a new concept, but the fact that people in some often very desperate situations can come out of that just by having one person listen to them intently for an hour a week can bring them out of that situation. I think that's a really good reminder for me of how important that skill is to cultivate for the people around you. And I think it's also a reciprocal thing. Anyway, I hope you got as much as I did out of that. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns about the episode, please hit me up on Twitter at ContraPodcast or email at contrapodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.